One of the things that has certainly received quite a bit of attention and quite a bit of focus in recent years has been the whole subject of education. There have been studies run and consultants who have gotten rich, and there has been money spent and money proposed to be spent. There have been all sorts of ideas that have come about. There have been attempts to start children into school at earlier and earlier ages. The idea, of course, seems to be that what we need to do is to get the, quote, experts involved, and they will, you know what an expert is, don't you? That is someone who has come to know more and more about less and less until he knows absolutely everything about nothing, and he's become an expert. So anyway, the upshot of all of this is that there has been increasing efforts to try and focus in and say, look, we need to upgrade the education of our children. And now there's emphasis being put on a comparison of the educational attainments and the educational requirements, for instance, in the United States and in Japan. Now, back at an earlier time, back in the 50s and early 60s, there was, at the time when the Russians put the Sputnik up, there was a great effort, and the federal government really was kind of the beginning of their involvement in a very major way in education, of saying, hey, you know, this is a matter of national security. We're going to lose our lead. The Russians are going to take over. We've got to dump all this money in education. So money has been spent and all kinds of things have happened, and now we find ourselves still in a dilemma. And there are comparisons that are being made, and almost every week or two you read something, a comparison being made between education in the United States and in Japan. And there's emphasis about what is it that our children should know and how should they go about learning it and who should teach it to them. Well, my purpose this morning is not to get into the academic areas primarily, but to focus in on some things that are absolutely essential that every child should know, and that really are the basis. The lack of knowledge in these areas is a basis of many of the problems that we're facing in this nation, whether the problems that are being noticed in the schools or elsewhere. God says through the pen of the prophet Hosea, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Now, there is a great plethora of technical knowledge and information that was not even available. It was not known a few years ago. There is a great abundance of technical knowledge and information, and yet there are essential things that are not known and not understood. God says, ultimately, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Now, there is knowledge that is essential for our children to have. There are things that every child should know, and I want to focus in upon 5 things that every child should know. And these are things that if a child knows and understands these things, he has the basis to learn everything else he needs to know. Now, whose responsibility is it? Do we need another government program to teach these things, these essential areas? Is that the solution? You know, maybe Congress needs to appropriate several $1 billion, and we need to build up this vast bureaucracy to teach these essential things. God has a far simpler solution to it. He says in Deuteronomy 6, in verse 6, he says, "These words which I command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently unto your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." Now, this presupposes something. This presupposes that parents are going to be interacting with their children. And God says here, there is information, there is knowledge, there are words that need to be taught. There is information that is essential to be conveyed. And he says, who should do it? Did he say the priests and the Levites should do this? No. Did he say the judges or those that assist the king or the judges should do this? No. Did he say the captains of the tribes should do this? No. He said, you shall teach diligently unto your children. So this is a parental responsibility. This is something that I am responsible for as an individual, as a parent, to convey to my child. This is something that you as a parent are responsible individually to convey to yours. You shall teach them diligently. Now, let's just kind of notice word by word here. You, that's who's supposed to do the teaching, shall teach them diligently. Now, diligence carries with it the idea, the connotation of effort. There is some energy being put into it. There is some effort being put into it. To be diligent carries with it the concept of being consistent. You know, if we refer to someone as being a diligent worker, that does not simply mean he works hard some of the time. We've all known people that they did what they did in kind of fits and starts. Boy, they'd attack something and they'd go to it for a while, and then they kind of lose interest and quit. And they may put out a lot of energy and a lot of effort for a short amount of time, but they never stuck to anything. Diligence carries with it the connotation not merely of being a hard worker, but of doing a thorough job, being consistent, of sticking with it. Diligence carries the connotation of a day-in, day-out approach. So we are to teach these things diligently unto our children, to do so carefully, to do so with consistency. Now, how do we do this? He says you talk of them when you sit in your house. Now, this presupposes that people talk when they sit in their house. And that is a great leap of faith when you look at the typical American family, because the chances are there may not be a word that is exchanged. Everybody's tuned in to the television. You know, maybe Dad is laid back, stretched out in front of the TV in the living room, and the kid is off in his room or her room, and maybe tuned in to her own or his own television set, or tuned in with the earphones, you know, where they can go around the house kind of looking like they have some sort of a disease. I mean, they've got this kind of jerk, you know, and they kind of walk around, and they look like they're, you know, you ought to rush them to the emergency room or something. They're going into convulsions. No, they're tuned in, which means they're tuned into something, but they've also tuned out to whatever is around them, and they've tuned into their own world. In a lot of cases, they're turned off along with it. At least turned off on the parents. Well, this presupposes that parents and children sit down and talk together, because it says you talk of them when you sit in your house. So this is, kind of presupposing that families are actually going to sit around and talk. They're not going to spend the whole evening sitting in front of the television day in and day out. That everybody's not going to be tuned in his own room, in his own way, that the family is going to be fractured, but that people actually sit around and talk. Sit around and talk. You talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way. Now this assumes that parents and children are going to do things together, that they're going to take walks, that they're going to be out and away from the house sometimes, that they're not simply going to kind of meet one another in passing, and that's the only time they see one another, but that they will walk by the way. They'll take walks together. They'll spend time together. They'll do things together. It says, when you lie down, when you rise up. So we have a focus in that there would be then time that would be spent in the evening prior to bed. There would be time spent in the morning when people get up. That there is going to be a certain investment of time. Now that is presupposed here. That's a basis of teaching. Now teaching, and as it's used here, it's interesting. The word for teach is a different word than is often used for teach in the Old Testament. The literal Hebrew is to whet or to sharpen. You know how you use a whetstone and you sharpen a knife? Well, that's the word that's actually used here. You are to kind of whet the appetite of your children. You are to sharpen them. Now, the emphasis is not that, all right, kid, it's time for you to be taught. Sit down. I'm going to lecture you for a while. And then, you finish and you say, all right, you learned it? Yeah. Can I go back to doing, yeah, sure, okay. This is talking about utilizing the opportunities that present themselves in a day-in, day-out basis. Utilizing opportunity to whet their appetite for more, to sharpen their senses and their perception, to take advantage of day-to-day circumstances of real life. Take advantage of opportunities when you're together, which presupposes you will be together, because you're not going to have opportunities if you're not together. So there are certain presuppositions, and we need to understand those. It presupposes that families are going to spend some time sitting around and talking, carrying on a conversation in the evenings. That they're going to do things together. They're going to take walks. They're going to be in circumstances where they have opportunity to talk, and they have a situation that is conducive to conversation. And that they will utilize those opportunities to orient the children, to sharpen their understanding and their perception. So, God focuses in on the how and the who. It's not, the solution is not some study to waste billions of taxpayers' dollars to create some vast bureaucratic nightmare that hasn't solved anything. It's not just to throw money after the problem. It is a solution that has to start in individual families and homes. It is a solution that is not to be just delegated out to somebody, send them off here, there, yonder, let somebody teach them, let somebody take them, but to utilize the opportunities as they present themselves to us, certainly on the level in which the child is. We have to communicate with our children on the level in which they understand, but to take advantage of circumstances, to take advantage of opportunities. And there will be many such opportunities, many things that come up. Now, let's go on a little further than this. We see that there is an emphasis on the importance of this teaching, this sharpening, this whetting of a child's appetite, this sharpening of their perception and their understanding. But let's go on beyond that and focus in specifically on 5 areas, 5 things that every child should know. I think, and I believe that I can prove this from the Bible, that the most important thing for every child to know, and the first thing that every child should know, is that he or she is loved. I think that's the starting point. Now, I say I believe I can prove this from the Bible. Let's go back to 1 John. If we're going to teach them of God's way, and we're going to teach them, we want the things that are going to anchor them to a perception and an understanding of God and God's truth, let's notice a little bit of what God tells us. He tells us in the book of 1 John that gives us some insight into his nature. We're told in 1 John 4, verse 8, "He that loves not knows not God, for God is love." The most basic, foundational component of the character and nature of God is love. If we are going to teach anyone about God, then there is a starting point of understanding and perceiving about love. Now, that's the first thing that we have opportunity to teach our children from the moment that a child is born. We can begin to teach our children that they're loved. Because the first opportunity is to take that child, to hold it, to cuddle it, for a mother to hold and to nurse that child. You know, God could have designed some other way or something else. But God has designed it in such a way that when a mother nurses her baby, that she is holding and cuddling that child in a very close, intimate relationship. And that there's more than just food that is being conveyed to that child. That child is learning to love. The child learns to love because he is being loved. You see, that's the way we learn to love. We learn to love by being loved. That's what we're told, you see, in 1 John, speaking of God, that we love Him because He first loved us. 1 John 4:19. See, how do we learn to love God? We love Him because He first loved us. We learn to love by being loved. A child will learn to love by being loved. You know, and the first opportunity of that, when that baby is first born, one of the very first thing that happens as soon as that little child is cleaned up is that the mother will take it and hold it, and that little child begins to nurse, and you know, sometimes takes a little bit of even takes a little bit of teaching for them to figure out how to do it, but once they get the hang of it, they don't want to stop, and they're really ready to go to it, and they begin to develop that close bond as they're held there next to their mother. And so every time that child is fed, and every time that child is hungry, and believe me, when they're little that way, they, you know, about all they want to do is eat and sleep. I mean, they eat until they go to sleep, and they sleep until they wake up and they're ready to eat again. And so they have a lot of opportunity to be held, to be cuddled, to be held close, to be made to feel secure, and to begin to learn what love is all about. Now, love is not limited to something that merely the mother should extend to the child, because God pictures Himself as our Father. And God as a Father is not in any way shy or bashful or embarrassed about expressing His love for us. And as human fathers, we should certainly express and convey our love to our children. And as a little small child, to take them, to hold them, to cuddle them, to play with them, to be affectionate to them, to convey that love. But, you know, a child's need for love doesn't stop when he's weaned. A child's need for love does not stop when they're 3 years old or when they're 6 years old and enter school. Now, maybe the means and the way that love is expressed may change a little bit as time goes on, but it is always appropriate that there should be expressions of love and affection, that we should tell those that we love them. God tells us that He loves us, and He demonstrates that love for us, and He tells us. You go through the instruction that John had on the subject of love and all the things he said about love in 1 John, and talking about our relationship with God and that relationship as a parent-child relationship, we can see a little bit of the emphasis God puts on it. Now, God is our parent and we are His children, and we can understand a lot about child rearing by understanding the way that God deals with us. Hebrews tells us that God deals with us as with sons. Hebrews 12 tells us that. So God deals with us as children. And if God deals with us as children, we can learn a lot about how to deal with our own children by going back and reading what God says. So there is the starting point of love. Now, love certainly includes expression of love. It includes expressions of affection. It includes expressions of love and of concern. But love involves more than that. Let's notice in 1 Corinthians 13, let's just get a little bit of insight into some of the characteristics of love. Sometimes we've all read over this and we understand many aspects, but sometimes we have not thought of it in terms necessarily of our children. You see, we're told, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 13:8 that love never fails. See, love is not conditional. Love is not based on the fact that you do this and I will love you. God commends His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. God's love was not some conditional love that He looked down and He said, well, you have somehow earned or deserved this. God offers His love to us unconditionally. And that love never fails. And that is the kind of love that we as parents need to convey to our children. That they're loved, and they're loved unconditionally. That, many characteristics of love. Love, we're told in verse 4, is very slow to lose patience. Love is not impatient. A little child needs a lot of patience because they start out and everything they do is slow and awkward. Except sometimes getting into trouble. They're not slow at that, but they can manage to get into more in a few minutes than you can get them out of sometimes. But love is patient. See, love is not impatient. A little child takes him time to steady and to walk. As they walk, and their little steps are little short steps, and they have to learn to keep their balance. As they begin to do things, as they get older, and they want to help. Now, any of you who've had small children, you remember when your children wanted to help. Mom, you remember in the kitchen, you're trying to do something, and the little one kind of comes, and they're up there, and they're pulling, and they want to help. Can I help, Mommy? Well, what you feel like saying, and maybe you have said it sometimes, is the biggest help you can be is to just get out of the way. Just get out of here and let me do this. Well, that's true. You can do it better and more efficiently by yourself than with their help. But if you never give them an opportunity to help, they never learn how. They're going to be slow and awkward, and there may be times when you're in a hurry and you really can't take that particular moment to get them involved in it because there's a deadline. But if you're always in that big a hurry, then you maybe need to step back and evaluate your schedule and your priorities. Because giving them an opportunity to help ought to be a priority. That doesn't mean that every time they want to help everything that you just have to stop and let them. There are times, there are appropriate times and circumstances. But love is slow to lose patience. Love is kind. That's an important thing, and that's something that we want and we desire. That ought to be an aspect of our children, our dealing with our children. Love is kind. We're told that in verse 5 that love does not behave itself unseemly. Now that simply means, in more modern English, has good manners. We should treat our children with courtesy and with kindness. Please and thank you are something that should not simply be reserved for adults. That's a part of dealing with our children, dealing with them in love and showing them that they are loved. Well, there are many things we could go through here, but there is an importance of conveying love. Now, let's understand a little bit of what love is not. Some parents have mistakenly confused love with indulgence, and they have operated under the mistaken impression that, well, I just can't bear to discipline my child or to spank my child. I just love them too much. Well, that's really not love that you have, because God says in Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 24, "He that spares his rod hates his son. He that loves him chastens him early." God says if you don't discipline your children, you are showing hatred to them. A lack of proper discipline, a refusal to discipline, is not an indication of love. It is an indication from what God says right here. God defines it as hatred. He says you're not concerned, because it is a lack of concern for the long-term good of the child. See, love is concerned for the long-term good. He that loves his child chastens him early. You begin the process of discipline early. Now, it is certainly discipline that is appropriate for the age of the child. But the child, we have to understand that love and discipline are not opposites. Love and discipline go together. Now, part of the problem is if discipline is not administered early, if you allow things to drag on and to drag on, what happens is that eventually you react to a bad situation and you explode and you blow up because you haven't dealt with it early when it needed to be dealt with, and when it was little, you let this little problem and that little problem and all these things kind of add up, and then something happened and you got mad, and boy, I'll show you. Well, if we love them, we're going to chasten them early. We begin to deal with them, and we begin to deal with them early on. Because if we let problems rock along that need attention, sooner or later it's going to create a crisis. It's going to create a problem. Love is not to be confused with being indulgent with our children. Sometimes love must be tough. When you read the story of the prodigal son, and we read it from the standpoint of the son, I think we also ought to read it from the standpoint of the father, and we realize that the father was motivated by love in what he did. And one of the things that he did when things reached the level that they did was the father loved the son enough to let him hit bottom, learn a lesson, and come to repentance. The father did not continue to enable him in destructive behavior. Some people confuse love. I remember one man who over a period of years virtually bankrupted himself, bailing his son out of scrapes. The boy kept getting thrown in jail for drunk driving or for this or for that. He was always in trouble. Had no respect for anyone or anything, at least that's what his actions would indicate. Over a period of years, the amount of money that the father spent in lawyers' fees and fines and in all kinds of things was just incredible. He as an older man, as a widower, came to a point where he was almost bankrupt as a result of this. And you know what? The boy was still in trouble, but he was getting in trouble now that no amount of money on the father's part was going to get him out of. Now, that father needed to have read the parable of the prodigal son at a much earlier time and to have understood that what he was doing was to confuse the enabling of sick behavior, of self-destructive behavior, to confuse that with love. He was making it possible for the son to continue to get in worse and worse shape because he prevented him from learning a lesson. If you don't learn a lesson on something small, you'll be forced to learn it on something big. And if the lesson you learn is the fact that whatever you get into, you never have to suffer the consequences of what you do because somebody's always there to bail you out, and so it doesn't matter what you do because you can always get out of it, you're learning a very bad lesson because you can get into trouble that nobody can get you out of. And love sometimes has to be tough. I think I bring that in because I think we have to understand that there are things that should not be confused with love. That doesn't mean you forget about them. That doesn't mean you hate them. That doesn't mean you don't care. But it means that we have to deal with things based on the circumstances and the situation. But it is important for our children to learn from the very earliest age that they're loved, to know their parents love them, to have that love expressed verbally, to have it expressed physically in terms of display of affection, to have it expressed in our actions, to have it expressed in kindness and in concern and in our time, to have it expressed in all of these ways. It is important for our children to know that we love them. And it is important for them to understand that that love we have is unconditional. Now, we may not love their actions and their deeds. And there may come a time when we have to let them suffer the consequences of their action, but we still love them. We still love them. And we love them, and we love them enough that we're willing to discipline them when it is appropriate, and we don't put that off in a way that can be to their detriment. But it is important for our children, and I think the starting point, the most essential thing for every child to know, is to know that he's loved. And that is a lesson that we can begin to teach our children from the moment they're born. They can begin to love. They can begin to learn that. Learn that by our investment of time and effort and opportunity, and to learn that in all of these ways. That is a very important thing, and I think a starting point. Now, a second lesson, a child needs first and foremost to know that he's loved. Secondly, a child needs to learn how to respect himself and others. First they must learn and come to know that they're loved. Secondly, they have to learn and come to know what respect is all about. Now, a child has to learn to respect himself as a part of respecting others. The basis of self-respect is to understand what God says in Genesis chapter 1. You remember in Genesis chapter 1, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion." Every one of us are human beings made in the image of God. That is the basis of self-respect. That is the basis of respect for others. That is the basis of respect for ourselves, is the understanding that we are human beings made in the image of God. And that really is the basis. Now, let's look a little bit and see something about self-respect and the basis of self-respect, and one of the reasons that's important. Because one thing that I think is important to realize, and learning to respect themselves and to respect others, and the two go hand in hand together, because understand this: when proper self-respect is replaced, when self-respect is replaced with a sense of shame or degradation, it results in self-destructive behaviors on the part of the individual. When self-respect is replaced with a sense of shame and degradation, it results in self-destructive behaviors on the part of the individual. And you can talk the whole gamut of everything. I mean, what are self-destructive behaviors? Everything from the abuse of drugs and alcohol to immorality. That's pretty self-destructive. It can involve suicide. That's about the most self-destructive thing you can do in the sense of an instant self-destruct. Though some of these other things can be slow suicide in reality. I mean, you can get into the whole realm of for instance, eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, things that a few years ago most people had never even heard of. In fact, a lot of doctors hadn't heard of not that many years ago, and are fairly commonly talked about and written about. There are a lot of self-destructive behaviors. There are a lot of self-destructive behaviors in which people sometimes become engaged, in which young people sometimes become engaged. And when a person is involved in self-destructive behavior, there is a lack of proper self-respect. That proper self-respect has been replaced with a sense of shame, a sense of worthlessness, a sense of feeling dirty and degraded. That's frankly one of the reasons that abuse, the child abuse, that sexual abuse is so destructive in the long term. Because it conveys a message to the child of shame and degradation, and it undermines self-respect. And that's why it is so destructive in the long term, so damaging. Because it undermines that. It undermines proper self-respect. It replaces it with destructive feelings and attitudes, and it can lead into many self-destructive behaviors. Now let's look here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18. Let's notice a little bit and see how self-respect, a proper respect for ourselves, is tied in with appropriate behavior. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18, it says, "Flee fornication. Get away from immorality. Every sin that a man does is without the body, but he that commits fornication sins against his own body." Immorality is a sin against your own body. What? Don't you know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit which is in you, which you have of God, and you are not your own? You are bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. You belong to God. Now, God says your body is the temple of His Holy Spirit. Let's notice back in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Verse 16. "Know you not that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." Now, God says that we belong to Him. Our body is the temple of His Holy Spirit. And that we are to respect ourselves, we're to respect our bodies, if for no other reason than the fact that God dwells in them through His Spirit. We're made in the image of God, ultimately to have an opportunity to be born into the family of God, and that God dwells in us through His Spirit. And the basis, you see, we're told the basis of avoiding immorality, the basis of avoiding some of this self-destructive conduct is a proper respect for who and what we are. Recognizing that we belong to God. Our body is the temple of God's Spirit. We're to value and to appreciate what God values and what He appreciates. So we have here a focus on respect, and that a proper respect for ourselves, a proper respect for who and what we are, means that it is going to lead to an avoidance of self-destructive behavior, because here it's mentioned in the context of avoiding immorality. Why is a person told that, in what context, you see, is avoiding immorality brought in? Well, it is brought in the context of understanding that our body is the temple of God's Spirit. We want to show respect for where God dwells and for what is important to God, and not to degrade it and to drag it through the mud and to do things that are going to be destructive. So we want to be conscious of that. That is the basis of self-respect. We respect, we care for ourselves, we take care of ourselves in terms, even in terms of health. That's one of the reasons that we should. We should be careful in terms of our health and diet and exercise and things of this sort. It's certainly a matter of balance, and people can go overboard, but we want to show proper respect and care, because our body is the temple of God's Spirit. When self-respect is replaced with a sense of shame or degradation, it results in self-destructive behaviors on the part of the individual. And that can be the whole realm of anything from immorality to drug and alcohol abuse to the various eating disorders of anorexia, bulimia, to any number of others that you can come up with. That I think is important. And you see, respect for ourselves is part of the basis of then conveying respect to others, because we should properly respect ourselves and we should properly respect others. And learning to display and to show that respect. Notice in 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 17 says, "Honor all men. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king." Now, it goes on, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, with all reverence. Now, the context, or what it's talking about here, when it says honor, that's part of the definition of respect. If you look up the word respect in the dictionary, you'll find that respect means to show honor, to show admiration. It means to an expression of esteem, to view or to treat someone with some degree of deference or courtesy or esteem. It's a feeling of esteem or regard, to show honor and esteem for. That's what it means to respect. So the word honor or esteem, as it is used here in verse 17, place value on, is really kind of the literal concept for the Greek, to place great value on everyone, to place great value on all men, to show honor and respect and esteem for everyone. Because regardless of what that person is doing, he or she is a human being made in the image of God with the ultimate potential of becoming a part of the family of God. And so there is an esteem, there is a respect, there is an honor that we should learn to show to everyone. There's a special love that we should show to the brotherhood. We should reverence God, stand in awe of God. We should show respect and honor to the king. Now, you may look at a little contrast here. We show honor and esteem. We show respect to everyone. There is a special bond of love that binds us to one another in the church. And that is a bond of love that is a little different than maybe the feeling that we have to just everyone with whom we come in contact. But we owe everyone the responsibility to show proper respect, to treat them with courtesy, to treat them with respect, to treat them with proper honor and esteem, to place a proper value on everyone, every human being, because Jesus Christ died for that person the same as he did for you and for me. And if Christ placed that kind of value, if God placed that kind of value on them, we should show value or appreciate their value and show respect to everyone. There should be a special bond of love that binds us to one another that goes over and above the esteem and the respect that we show everyone. There is a love over and above that binds us to one another in the church. Now, we should stand in awe and reverence of God. We should deeply reverence God and stand in awe of God, to be deeply impressed with God. Now, we don't convey that same attitude toward a human ruler, but we should honor that human ruler. We should show respect. We should value him for the office that he holds. We should show the respect that is due that office. It is proper and appropriate to show respect. I think one of the most tragic changes that has taken place in our society in the last 25 years has been the absolute deterioration of respect. And I think any of you who think back over a period of time, let's say from the mid-60s till now, that one of the characteristic hallmarks of the changes in society has been the deterioration of respect. You talk to someone who is taught in the public schools for 25 years or more and ask them if they have noticed a change in that regard. And I think without question they will tell you that one of the biggest changes they've seen is the absolute lack of respect that people show by comparison to what was shown virtually everywhere 25, 30, 40, 50 years ago and more. And there's a significant, if you go back in terms of what was happening culturally and politically and all of these things in the United States in the 1960s and the mid-60s, there is a reason why that becomes kind of a benchmark date as far as the loss of respect. Loss of respect for authority figures. And if you don't respect those who are in authority, you're not going to be respecting anybody else very long. If you don't respect those who are over you, you're not going to respect those who are under you. You're not going to respect, there's a loss of respect. And God says that we should respect everyone, show proper esteem and respect, that we should stand in awe of God. We don't stand in awe of a human ruler and reverence him in that way, but we should honor him. We should respect his office, and there are many places that we could go. You know, there are many things in God's Word about respect. It talks about, for instance, in Leviticus 19, it says, rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man. Show respect to those who are older. Show respect to age. Rise up. Stand up when an older person comes in the room. That's a token of respect. If you want to find an example of respect, you want to see how to convey respect, go back and read Genesis 18. Read the account when Abraham was sitting in his tent there in the heat of the day. You know, when it's hot, you want to find a good shady spot, and you sit down, and it's hot, and you get comfortable, and you don't feel like stirring. And he looked up, and he saw three men coming from a distance. Turned out to be Christ and two angels. And Abraham, it says, ran to meet them, which means he obviously stood up. You know, it says he was sitting, and when he saw them, he ran out to meet them. So we can presuppose that he stood up. You can't run to meet somebody just on your hands and knees, see? So he stood up, When he saw them coming, he ran out to meet them. He bowed to them. He was insistent on, please come and sit down and let me get a good spot for you here, and let me get you something to drink, and let me, you're bound to be, your feet are hot and tired after walking. Let me get some water to wash your feet. Let me go and get you something to eat. There was you go through and you read it, and one of the things that is evident is the hospitality that was characteristic of Abraham, the great respect that he conveyed in the way that he dealt with people, the level of courtesy and respect and esteem. Now, this was Christ and two angels, and say, well, Christ shows up at my door, I'd do that too. I'd get up, keep my seat for everybody else, but, sure, I'd get up. Well, you might read Matthew 25 when Jesus goes through and he divides the sheep from the goats. And you remember what he said? He said, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. So, if we think, sure, I'd do all those things Abraham did if Christ and two angels showed up. What's the chance of that? I mean, how frequently have you had a few angels drop by your door? You think, don't have to worry about that. But Jesus Christ said in Matthew 25 that the way we treat one another is really, he takes it personally. He takes it personally. He says, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you've done it unto me. So there ought to be a characteristic respect. That's something that we want to instill in our children. The importance of respecting themselves and the importance of respecting others. And that is something they're not going to get from the society around, and it is essential. They need to learn, first and foremost, to know that they're loved. They need to learn, secondly, to respect themselves and to respect others. Thirdly, they need to learn how to control themselves, or how to impose self-discipline, if you will. Now, that discipline originally must be externally imposed, but it is externally imposed for the purpose of helping them to develop internal self-discipline. Learn to develop proper self-control. That is very important as far as their future development in life, because if we can't properly control ourselves, what are we ever going to be able to control or to discipline? Now it starts out that a little child is born, and that little child originally can't control really anything about himself. He can't even control his own bodily functions. They must learn over a period of time how to exercise certain control. They learn to control their muscles and gradually to walk. They learn to control their bodily functions, and they learn that certain things are appropriate and not appropriate. That's really the whole lesson of self-control. That we learn that certain things are appropriate for certain places. Little children learn that, and sometimes maybe when you were potty training your children, you may have some funny stories to tell and think about. Maybe you don't want to tell them and embarrass the child, but you think of some of the funny things that happen. But you see, they had to learn, and they weren't born knowing that certain things are appropriate for certain times and certain places, and other things are not appropriate. There are things the front yard is appropriate for, and there are things that it is inappropriate for. A little child isn't born knowing that, and sometimes it's funny, but if what's funny when they're 2 is less funny when they're 6, and is much less funny when they're 15, and the older they get, the less funny it becomes. So it is important that we learn, you see, that a child learns proper self-control, self-discipline. In Proverbs 29 and verse 15, God inspired Solomon to write, "The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings his mother to shame." The rod and reproof. Now, it takes the two together. It takes a positive reinforcement. There are times you see that a consequence has to be visited on the child. This is the rod. That may be, in the case of a small child, maybe your hand, or maybe 3 fingers on your, of your hand on the properly padded part of a child that has been designed by God to be the recipient of some of this. God didn't design. God didn't mean that discipline was to be administered on the child. Maybe your hand, or maybe 3 fingers on your, of your hand on the properly padded part of a child that has been designed by God to be the recipient of some of this. God didn't design. God didn't mean that discipline was to be administered on the head and on all sorts of places, as far as the kinds of the kinds of things that sometimes can happen. Rather, it is the rod and reproof. Now, it involves proper discipline. It involves instruction, reproof, explaining to the child what is right or what is wrong, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. It involves teaching them. It says a child left to himself brings his mother to shame. Or they will embarrass you. They'll create problems. And the problems they'll create when they're little are nothing by comparison to the problems they'll create when they're much older. And it says in verse 17, correct your son, and he shall give you rest. Yes, he shall give you delight to your soul. Now, a lot of parents, their children don't give them much rest, and they don't give them any delight to their soul because they haven't been properly corrected. A child can learn to sit up and be still. Sometimes they get going, and you ever had it? Now, I'm sure most of you as parents have, where it seems like that they really get on a roll. You can't get them out of one thing before they go and they get in something else. And you take them and you discipline them and you turn them loose, and pretty soon they're just right back in something else, and it just you got a problem going. Sometimes maybe it's a matter that they're just in a bad attitude. They're pouty. They're feeling sorry for themselves, whatever it may be. We want to deal with the attitude, not simply with the action. God deals with attitude. Correct your son, he'll give you rest. Sometimes what you need to do is put him up there on the couch or in a chair and say, sit here and fold your hands and get your attitude straightened up. And when you get your attitude straightened up, come on in here where I am, and things will be okay. You sit here and you sit here, you fold your hands, and you straighten up your attitude. And that's important, and I'll guarantee you that they can learn that. They can learn that, and that was something that there are many times as a small child where what they need is to simply sit still for a little bit and to have a chance to think about it. And if they don't sit still, you put them there, and you may have to spank them, you may have to correct them. You see, but if you start early on it, they learn. They can understand that. They're capable of sitting still. I mean, good grief, you can train a dog to sit still, right? You ever have, you can tell him sit, and he sits. Now, I don't think there's any child here that's not smarter than a dog. So operate under the premise that, a child can learn, if the dog can learn it, the child ought to be able to learn it on a snap. It ought to be a lot easier. They can learn. But it says, correct your son and he'll give you rest. If you don't correct them and you just nag at them, they won't give you rest, and you won't give them rest. And they never learn to control themselves. They never learn to control themselves. See, that's part of okay, you sit here, straighten up your attitude, and when you get your attitude straight, you come on in here where we are. Come on in here where we are. And then that they can, then if there's something that needs to be talked about, it can be. You can love them, you can do something, and they've learned to get control of themselves. You know, sometimes parents wind up and they'll discipline their child or give them a smack or two, but then the child goes around a bad attitude, mad for the rest of the day, and pouting and just in a raunchy attitude. Huh. Regardless of what they're doing, the attitude is probably a bigger problem than whatever the action was. Attitude is very important with God, and we want to deal with our children based on attitude. Based on attitude. Now, understand that controlling our actions and stuffing our feelings are two totally different things. Controlling our actions and stuffing our feelings are two totally different things. We have to learn to control our actions. There are things that are appropriate. There are things that are inappropriate. There are times that are appropriate. There are times that are inappropriate. It is important that we learn, and that our children learn self-control, that they learn proper self-discipline. But that doesn't mean that if a child should be given certainly opportunities to express themselves and to talk about things, that it's not controlling, it's not simply learning proper self-control just to stuff and to deny whatever feelings that we have. Sometimes feelings have been hurt. Sometimes there is anger. There is resentment. There are problems. There are things that have happened. There should be a basis of open communication to get the problem out, to look at it, to see what it is, to resolve it, to seek to make a solution for it. You know, a child should certainly be allowed to express himself, but to express himself in an appropriate way. In an appropriate way. We have to learn, you know, there are times that we have to exercise a certain amount of self-control. There are things that you don't do. If you don't learn to exercise self-control, what happens when somebody does something that makes you mad? What happens when you're treated unfairly? Because you will be in life. All of us are and will be. What do? You pick up something and club the guy? Or you do like, I remember years ago coming home from church there in Houston, coming down the freeway. I think I've told this story before. I don't know all of the incident that happened, but somebody had made some quick move on the freeway and cut somebody off when they were getting ready to get out. The next thing I knew, this guy was pulling up even with the other one, and he rolled the window down and he was waving a pistol out the window. Boy, you know, I'll get you. You messed me up. Now, here was a person that had certainly learned a lot of self-control. Now, I can understand. I've been upset when people, when somebody pulled in front of me or cut me off or inconvenienced me in some way on the road. I suspect most of you have too if you've done much driving. But what do you do about it? You begin to shake your fist and yell and curse at the guy, or you get a gun out and threaten to shoot him. You know, there's a matter of self-control. Maybe it wasn't nice what the person did. Maybe it wasn't right. Maybe it was inconsiderate. Maybe it was rude. Maybe it was a lot of things. But there are responses that are appropriate, and there are responses that are inappropriate. And if self-control isn't learned, then if a person just does whatever they feel like doing, and they don't control themselves, then you're going to wind up and you might as well rent the sub-basement of Bedlam, because you're going to have chaos and confusion. We're told in Proverbs 16:32, he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He that rules his spirit than he that takes a city. Self-control is something of great value, something of importance. There's a very good article in the newest Youth 90. It's a lead article on the subject of Alexander the Great. He conquered the world, but he couldn't conquer himself. You know, it's interesting when you read it and you realize the importance of self-control, proper self-control. And, you know, there are many, many things. You could go through an entire Bible study or an entire sermon on that. But, you know, there is a matter of learning proper self-control, self-discipline. And that can be, you can overdo anything. Self-control is needed. I mean, it says in Proverbs 25:16, it says, have you found honey? Eat as much as sufficient for you. Eat what you need. But stop there, lest you be filled therewith and vomit it. You know, you can overdo anything. Honey's good. You enjoy it. But you can make yourself sick, even on something that's good. There is a need for self-control. And that is something that is very important for a child to learn. A child needs to know, needs to learn that he's loved. He needs to learn how to respect himself and to respect others. And he needs to learn how to control himself. He also needs to learn how to set and achieve goals. How to set and achieve goals. Let's just notice briefly a couple of things on that. In Proverbs 13, verse 11, it says, wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathers by labor shall increase. Talking about get-rich-quick schemes, that's not going to amount to anything, but work hard and be careful, and that'll increase. Now notice down in verse 19, it says, the desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, but it is an abomination to fools to depart from evil. The desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. You set a goal and you achieve it. There is a sense of a satisfaction and accomplishment. God has built us to need that sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. When God finished the work of creation at the end of 6 days, you know what he did? It says, and the Lord God beheld all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. When God finished the work of creation and the Sabbath began, you know what he did? He stepped back and he looked at it and he smiled and he says, that's great. That's just the way I wanted it. That is very good. Have you ever done something, all of us have you ever done something creative? You ever made something, built something, put something together? Put a lot of effort into a project? What did you want to do when you finished it? I mean, it can be anything from a nicely decorated cake to something you sewed or something you built or whatever it may be. You want to step back and look at it for a little bit. You want to step back and look at it. Think, boy, that looks pretty good. And there's a high, a right kind of a high. But someone who has never learned to set and accomplish goals will never experience that high. Will never experience that sense of achievement and accomplishment. And you see, the absence of that sense of achievement and accomplishment is frustration. That's what frustration is. Frustration is the absence of a sense of satisfaction and achievement and accomplishment. That's what frustration is. It's the opposite of that sense of achievement. Now, you can never have that sense of achievement if you don't set a goal and achieve it. So, our children need to learn how to set and achieve goals. The desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. It feels good to set a goal and to accomplish it. Now, for that to be done, the goal needs to be high enough that you've got to reach for it to where it means something when you do it. But it also needs to be low enough to be realistic. Because if you set a goal that is unreasonably high, if you set an unreasonable goal that you can never do, then after a while you become discouraged and think, oh, what's the use? Why try? So part of learning to set and achieve goals is learning to set goals that are realistic. Some children set goals that are unrealistic, and they try for a little bit, and then they become discouraged and give up and say, well, why try? I can't do it. So we need to teach our children how to set and achieve goals. There are many, many things we could look at that that deal with setting and achieving goals. In Proverbs 24:27, it says, "Prepare your work without, make it fit for yourself in the field, and afterwards build your house." Now, this has to do with priorities. This has to do with priorities, that there are things that need to be done first and other things that need to be done later. If we're going to teach our children how to set and achieve goals, that means that they learn priorities. They learn there are certain things that really need to be done first to set the stage for other things. This would certainly have to do with education. You know, the importance of getting an education and preparing yourself for life. Prepare your work without. Make it fit for yourself in the field. Be prepared to earn a living. You know, be prepared to earn a living before you get married and try to establish a family. That's what verse 27 means. In other words, set priorities. Nothing wrong with building a house, nothing wrong with getting married, but be prepared to take on that responsibility. Get ready to handle that responsibility. Prepare yourself for that. First set the goal of being ready. Because if you're going to set and achieve goals, you need to know how to set priorities. Verse 30. Here in Proverbs 24, it says, "I went by the field of the slothful and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. And lo, it was grown over with thorns and nettles, and nettles covered the face thereof. The stone wall thereof was broken down. I saw, and I considered it well. I looked upon it and received instruction. Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So is your poverty going to come like one that travels. Your want is an armed man." Here was somebody that didn't set goals and achieve them. They were lazy. They got sidetracked. They didn't tend to business, and things fell apart. There are many places that you could go. Proverbs 27:23 says, "Be you diligent to know the state of your flocks. Look well to your herds. For riches are not forever, and does the crown endure to every generation?" You know, if you don't keep up with what you have, if you don't set goals and tend to business, then whatever you have can dissipate. You need to learn how to set goals and achieve them. God tells us part of that back in Proverbs 6. He says, "Go to the ant. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, gathers her meat in the harvest." You know, takes advantage of opportunity. So children need to learn how to set and to achieve goals. How to set goals that are realistic. How to set and to achieve those goals. That's very important, to develop that sense of achievement and accomplishment. And so every child should know that he's loved. He should know and learn how to respect himself and respect others. Learn how to exercise self-control. Learn how to control himself. Learn how to set and achieve goals. And the final matter that is important to convey to our children, that is essential, is a knowledge of God's plan and purpose, and the child's part in that plan and purpose. Now, there are many, many places that we could go. You could go to Isaiah 2, where it summarizes the plan that God has. We might just notice here, in Isaiah chapter 2, in verse 2, it says, "It shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house, the government of God, is going to be established in the top of the mountains. And it'll be exalted above the hills, and all nations will flow in unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come you, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." It's going to come to pass in the last days that the God of heaven is going to set up his kingdom, his government. God has a great plan and purpose, and we can have a part in that. We need to convey that to our children, to help them to understand what is meant by that, to understand that God's Word is a source of knowledge and instruction about God. Understand, we'll just notice one other place in Isaiah, God's plan and purpose. Isaiah 25:6. "In this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of wines on the lees well refined. And he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all nations." Well, The world won't be blinded anymore. God is going to, in the last days, the government of God is going to be established, and all people will have a chance to be a part of that. Isaiah 2. Here in Isaiah chapter 25, we find that it's going to be a time of abundance that everyone will be able to share in. And the basis for that is that the covering, the veiled understanding is going to be removed. The world will have its eyes open and be able to understand the things that our children are having an opportunity to understand right now. That the time is going to come when everybody will have a chance to understand that. That it'll be a time ultimately, verse 8, when God will swallow up death in victory. And the Lord God will wipe away tears from off all faces, and the rebuke of His people shall He take away from off all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. God has a great plan and purpose that He's working out, and that we can understand and learn more of that plan and purpose. See, it says in Psalm 119, in verse 9, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed thereto, according to your word. Verse 11, your word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against you. Verse 105, your word was a lamp to my feet, a light to my path. A knowledge of God and His way, and of His plan. Understanding that there is a source that we can go to understand the very plan and purpose that the great God of heaven is working out. Brethren, we can look at many things, and we could focus on many things that we need to convey to our children. But I think what is very apparent when we look at the Scripture, that number one, God holds us as parents responsible for seeking to convey information to our children. He tells us that we are to do this by spending time with them and taking advantage of opportunities to teach them His ways, His principles. There are essential things, and I feel very clearly that if we take these 5 areas, and if our children truly learn that they're loved, that they learn to respect themselves and to respect others, they learn to exercise self-discipline, self-control, they come to know how to go about setting and achieving goals, they come to know and to understand God's plan and purpose and their part in it, that as they begin to understand and to have understanding in these 5 basic areas, they then have a basis upon which they can build to learn and to understand and to develop the knowledge and the insight that they need in the rest of their life and all other areas of their life. We have a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous responsibility in conveying information to our children, information that is the basis of a productive life here and now and in the future. Last week we focused on what is marriage, and we saw that that part of the primary emphasis was that God said that He might seek a godly seed. God places emphasis on marriage because that is the means of establishing a family, which is the means of preparing the next generation, of preparing a godly seed. This week we have sought to focus in on what is essential in preparing that godly seed.